Ukraine. Now, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has confirmed that a team of American negotiators are scheduled to arrive in Moscow next week for talks on ending the war in Ukraine. He said a controversial 28-point peace plan could form the basis for an agreement, but also claimed there was no point signing any kind of deal with the Ukrainian government because Russia regarded it as illegitimate.
As I understand, they decided that all 28 points should be grouped into 4 separate components. We received all this information. In general, we agree that the US-backed peace plan can be used as a basis for future agreements. But it would be impolite on my part to speak about any final versions, because there are none. Ukrainian troops must withdraw from the territories they hold, and then the fighting can cease. If they don't leave, then we shall achieve this by armed means.
Well, with me in the studio is our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. James, in the middle of that introduction, there's a fragment that they could work on the basis of this to make progress, and then a list of basic, huge roadblocks.
Yeah, which is the familiar Russian position, which is, yes, they want to talk, yes, they want to engage, but, and there are an awful lot of buts that mean that at the moment the Russians, we think, are not ready to sign anything. So as you said, Putin very, very clear, saying this is a basis for talks. He even at one point goes into one of the details and says, look, the Europeans, seem to think we want to invade them. Well, Mr. Putin said he'd be quite happy to sign a piece of paper saying Russia will not invade Europe, almost making a joke of it. But then, as you said, we heard in that clip, very, very explicitly, but before anything can happen, Ukrainian troops must withdraw from those territories, and only for the fighting to cease. And if they don't, then we will continue to achieve this by armed means. In other words, he is willing at the moment to carry on fighting. And secondly, as you pointed out, he still considers the Ukrainian government to be illegitimate. Therefore, he can't have any straightforward face-to-face negotiations, government to government. In other words, constant sort of roadblocks to any kind of progress, which means that for all the diplomacy that we've just seen over the last few weeks, what happens next week when the Americans sit down with the Russians, the bar is high for progress.
In terms of trying to make an assessment of where this goes, of course, we had seen in the last 7 days a huge amount of pressure on President Zelensky, even the suggestion that perhaps by the end of this week he would go to the US and sign some sort of deal. But you then get back to the absolute basics of what we heard today, which is trying to get Vladimir Putin on board. So if the answer still remains from Moscow, no, where does this go?
Well, the Ukrainians are trying to send as many positive signals as they possibly can to try and show that they're still in this game. So President Zelensky today has been very visible on social media, wishing President Trump a happy Thanksgiving in the United States. The head of the presidential office, Andriy Yermak, has been putting out on social media that the Ukrainians and the Americans are still talking. They're making a lot of progress on what was discussed at Geneva earlier this week. In other words, saying, look, that engagement continues. I think the problem remains this. At the moment, we see no evidence yet that the Russians are willing to stop fighting. President Putin said today, and he said it very explicitly, that look, the speed of our advances increases considerably, quote, month by month, the rate in which we return of our territories increases. He wants to keep fighting.
That, of course, is contested. Of course, there is a huge cost now for the Russian economy. But in terms of the American response, are we likely to see the sanctions button pressed even more than it has been in recent months? Where does Donald Trump go with all of this?
Well, as we saw after the failure of the Alaska talks in August, occasionally, he gets frustrated and he does take decisions. And that, in part, was one of the reasons that led to his decision to impose sanctions on Russian oil and gas. He might step that up, but we don't, if no progress is made in coming weeks, and the President Trump gets frustrated again, yes, it is highly likely that he will incur a cost on one side or the other. I think it's not yet clear which side he will vent his anger over.
Well, that's a really interesting final thought. James, thank you very much for taking us through that.